Well, the first person to speak will be Madam President Rousseff.
Eu primeiro gostaria. Bueno. Juan Manuel. El presidente Santos, and I also wanted to greet President Obama, with whom I had the opportunity of visit at the beginning of the week. We were able to meet in the United States. I wanted to say that America, Latin America, and the Caribbean are regions in the world that have had a history of long of difficulties in the last decades. We have gone through moments of recession, unemployment, crisis, and macroeconomic instability. I believe that in this process, and even through the democratic institutions, through the people, through our region, we've been able, each country has been able to accomplish in its own way, to have a differentiated process of economic growth in the last decade or in the last 2 decades. This process has been characterized by the employment, and also
as well as by actions which I deem to be very important, actions undertaken in order to redistribute income in my country, which is very much the reason why we have built a very substantial domestic market size-wise. And that is true for the vast majority of countries in this region. Given all of these facts, which are obviously not very important in that they have resulted in a structural change in our countries, I would like to, at this point, highlight the fact that the economic crisis has posed challenges for us. And I mean challenges precisely because inevitably an economic crisis of substantial proportions, as has been the case worldwide as of 2008, but again a crisis which in the current stage of the process has taken on a feature of stagnation and increased unemployment rates, as well as in the recent times an increase in income inequalities in developed countries, and this has been going on very speedily with a resulting deterioration of employment standards. I mean, all of these features and variables are the kind of variables which in the past affected our economies but have done so differently in the current crisis. In the past, when we experienced a crisis of this magnitude, our economies would go into a recession and would actually even incur very vast financial crisis. So the fact is that by contrast, in the past, the crises were different, but the fact is that today we are not entirely immune to all of these problems. And I have often highlighted one feature of this process, which for us is a source of great concern. I'm talking about the fact, about the way where the more developed countries, especially in the past year and a half in the Eurozone, the way such countries have actually responded or reacted to the crisis, especially through monetary expansion policies or quantitative easing, leading to what you might only describe as a monetary tsunami. I mean, if you stop and think about what happened back from 2008 to now, we have seen an increase of $9 trillion in the monetary mass circulating worldwide, and that is of course affecting not only the demand on the part of developed countries, which is going down, and obviously not the demand from developed countries is key for us. So that is also adversely impacting us in as much as it appreciates the value of our currencies, thus making our currencies in and of themselves a hurdle against the proper trade in goods and services, and ultimately changes our economies into an easy prey to deindustrialization processes. I, of course, acknowledge and recognize the merits and the value of the monetary expansionist or expansionary policies that have been put into place by central banks in order to avoid the extremely acute and serious liquidity crisis, which could have possibly otherwise have had devastating effects worldwide. Yes, I do acknowledge that, but what I am saying is that the expansionary monetary policies in and of themselves, in isolation, bring a protectionism element in themselves, which is precisely translated into the fact that these currencies, when they have nowhere to go, they will precisely move towards those markets which are often perceived as being the most stable markets, where of course some kind of arbitration can be engaged in. Obviously enough, one should put into place measures required to defend ourselves. Please notice I said defend and not protect. Of course, defending is different vis-a-vis protecting. Defending oneself means that a country will have to, of course, realize that it cannot allow its manufacturing base or industries to be cannibalized. And it is our view that it would be a very virtuous stance on the part of countries running a surplus if they could resort to not only monetary policies but also to investment expansion policies. I am not talking about current spending or government spending policies. I am rather talking about investment policies, which on the one hand would reduce unemployment in such regions or countries, but also on the other hand, such policies would also allow the resource stemming from monetary expansion to be allotted for bringing these countries out of the crisis and therefore fostering greater prosperity in the international marketplace. So, given that state of affairs, we have no choice but to, of course, acknowledge that in this region of the world or in this hemisphere, a few things are going on. Number one, the importance of the US economy, the importance of the American economy. The US economy has a hallmark, and that is true for the country as a whole. And that is a key, very important feature in this multipolar world that we are seeing emerge around us. And in very simple and broad strokes, may I list, for example, key features in the US economy, such as, for example, the huge flexibility or resiliency that is inherent to the US economy, its huge leadership in fields like science, technology, and information that is truly there in the US economy. And number three, this extremely and very substantial feature in the US economy. I'm talking about the very roots of the US democracy that were there at the very foundation of the nation, and which as such mean that, especially in a crisis situation or against the backdrop of a crisis, those values and features ultimately help the US and its economy to perform a key and very substantial role in this new emerging multipolar world, particularly as regards Latin America, where I think there's huge room for our relations to be marked by a spirit of partnership. And I mean a partnership, of course, between equal parties. I think the partnership between or among equal parties is an extremely germane or relevant factor amongst us in the region, and which means that two variables have been properly matured by now. Number one, the most important or developed country in the region, which is the United States, and Latin American countries as part of that that two-way relationship, especially considering that the Latin American and Caribbean countries have undergone through a very virtuous domestic expansion or domestic market expansion process, as I mentioned earlier. Furthermore, one point has to be highlighted and focused on, and that is the importance of ensuring integration of our countries and our economies. Whether you do it by ensuring proper diversification of production chains and therefore ensuring that production chains will be orchestrated or coordinated intra-regionally, in other words, within the region, or alternatively considering, for example, the fact that there are major partnerships to be engaged in the infrastructure arena, whether you're talking about energy or electricity. And also given the fact that we have significant industrial sectors that can be called upon to perform a concerted or orchestrated role as part of a broader integration process, which will prove to be a win-win formula as part of an integration effort amongst equals. I think we are very much making headway in that direction. May I underscore, for example, the outstanding growth in the trade relations between Colombia and Brazil, as well as the outstanding growth or expansion in investment relations or mutual investment relations between our two nations. And That's just one example I'm giving by way of illustration. But what I am saying is that this is a clear-cut example of what has also been going on with several other countries, or among several other countries in the region. There is huge potentiality for integration in the region. Now, why am I highlighting that point? Well, I'm highlighting that point because I think integration is a way for us to orchestrate efforts with a view to facing up to the adverse consequences of the crisis. Notwithstanding the fact that we have not been deeply affected by the crisis, the fact is that if the process goes adrift and continues, and if we, of course, as we have seen, if we notice the beginnings of a recession process leading to unemployment with a significant monetary expansion leading to inflation plus an economic bubble, if there is no investment, of course, inevitably and relentlessly there will be speculative bubbles and inflation. So for those of us in this region, in Latin America and in the Caribbean, once we engage in such a concerted action, coupling, of course, these efforts with the U.S. economy, it is absolutely key that we view this part of the world as a very conducive and instrumental region in the world where we can establish partnership-based relations among equal parties from a mutual investment perspective and from an integration and government coordination perspective, with a view to engaging in actions that are not protectionist in nature. After all, protectionism in our region has not led to economic growth nor to prosperity. In parallel, and at the same time, no one here is naive to the point of, thinking that one should not possibly defend oneself in the face of certain facts. I am nonetheless very optimistic as regards the relations in this hemisphere, among countries in the hemisphere, and above all, very optimistic as regards the relations that our Latin American and Caribbean countries can and should engage in the CELAC community of Latin American and Caribbean countries, UNASUR, Mercosur, G20, and all multilateral fora, with a view to ultimately coordinating sustainability processes that will help underpin our production bases, sectors, and investments, whether through FOSAN or through our own national development banks or through the IDB. In a nutshell, I think, and I believe, that the sweeping changes in this continent, in addition to waging a bet in or on the domestic markets and also on better income distribution policies, I think that the better performance of this continent will necessarily involve greater and fuller integration.
President Obama.
Well, first of all, I want to thank President Santos and the people of Colombia for the extraordinary hospitality in the beautiful city of Cartagena. We're having a wonderful time, and usually when I take these summit trips, part of my job is to scout out where I may want to bring Michelle back later for vacation. So we'll make sure to come back sometime in the near future. I want to acknowledge Luis Moreno of IDB, as well as Luis Villegas of the National Business Association of Colombia for helping to set this up, and everybody who's participating. As President Rousseff indicated, obviously we've gone through some very challenging times. These last 3 years have been as difficult for the world economy as anything that we've seen in our lifetimes. And it is both a result of globalization, and it is also a result of shifts in technology. The days when we could think of each of our economies in isolation, those days are long gone. What happens in Wall Street has an impact in Rio. What happens in Bogota has an impact in Beijing. And so I think the challenge for all of our countries, and certainly the challenge for this hemisphere, is how do we make sure that globalization and that integration is benefiting a broad base of people, that economic growth is sustainable and robust, and that it is also giving opportunity to a growing, wider circle of people and giving businesses opportunities to thrive and create new products and new services and enjoy this global marketplace. Now, I think the good news is that this hemisphere is very well positioned in this global economy. It is remarkable to see the changes that have been taking place in a relatively short period of time in Latin and Central America and in the Caribbean. When you look at the extraordinary growth that's taken place in Brazil, first under President Lula and now under President Rousseff, when you think about the enormous progress that's been made here in Colombia under President Santos and his predecessor, what you see is that a lot of the old arguments on the left and the right no longer apply. And what people are asking is, what works? How do we think in practical terms about delivering prosperity, training our people so that they can compete in a global economy? How do we create rule of law that allows businesses to invest with some sense of security and transparency? How do we invest in science and technology? How do we make sure that we have open and free trade at the same time as we're making sure that the benefits of free trade are distributed both between nations but also within nations? And the good news is, I think, that through various international organizations and organizations here within the hemisphere, we've seen enormous progress. Trade between the United States and Latin, Central, South America, Central America, and the Caribbean have expanded 46% since I came into office. 46%. Before I came to Cartagena, I stopped in Tampa, Florida, which is the largest port in Florida. And they are booming and expanding, and the reason is because of the enormous expansion of trade and commerce with this region. It's creating jobs in Florida, and it's creating jobs in Colombia, and it's creating jobs in Brazil and throughout the region. Businesses are seeing that if they have an outstanding product or an outstanding service, they don't have to restrict themselves to one market. They now have a regional market and ultimately a global market in which they can sell their goods and succeed. A couple of things that I think will help further facilitate this productive integration. Number one, the free trade agreement that we've negotiated between Colombia and the United States is an example of a free trade agreement that benefits both sides. It's a win-win. It has high standards. It's a high standards agreement. It's not a race to the bottom, but rather it says each country is abiding by everything from strong rules around labor and the environment to intellectual property protection. And so I have confidence that as we implement this plan, what we're going to see is extraordinary opportunities for both U.S. and Colombian businesses. So trade agreements of the sort that we have negotiated, thanks to the leadership of President Santos and his administration, I think point the way to the future. In addition, I think there is the capacity for us to cooperate on problems that all countries face, and I'll take just one example, the issue of energy. All of us recognize that if we're going to continue to grow our economies effectively, then we're going to have to adapt to the fact that fossil fuels are a finite resource and demand is going up much faster than supply. And there are also obviously significant environmental concerns that we have to deal with. So for us to cooperate on something like joint electrification and electric grid integration so that a country like Brazil that is doing outstanding work in biofuels or hydro energy has the ability to export that energy, but also teach best practices to countries within the region, create new markets for clean energy throughout the region, which benefits those customers who need electricity, but also benefits those countries that are top producers of energy. That's another example of the kinds of progress that we can make together. On the education front, every country in the region recognizes that if we're going to compete with Asia, if we're going to compete with Europe, we've got to up our game. We have to make sure that we've got the best trained workers in the world. We've got the best education system in the world. And so the work that President Rousseff and I are doing together to try to significantly expand educational exchanges and send young people who are studying science and engineering and computer science to the United States to study, if they're Brazilian, down to Brazil to study best practices in clean energy in Brazil. There's an enormous opportunity for us to work together to train our young people so that this hemisphere is filled with outstanding entrepreneurs and workers and allows us to compete more effectively. So there are a number of areas where I think cooperation is proceeding. Sometimes it's not flashy. I think that oftentimes in the press, the attention in summits like this ends up focusing on where are the controversies. Sometimes those controversies date back to before I was born. Sometimes I feel as if in some of these discussions, or at least the press reports, we're caught in a time warp, going back to the 1950s and gunboat diplomacy and Yankees and the Cold War and this and that and the other. That's not the world we live in today. And my hope is that we all recognize this enormous opportunity that we've got. And I know the business leaders who are here today, they understand it. They understand that we're in a new world and we have to think in new ways. Last point I want to make. I think when you think about the extraordinary success in Brazil, the success in Colombia, a big piece of that is governance. You can't, I believe, have over the long term successful economies if you don't have some basic principles that are being followed: democracy and rule of law, human rights being observed, freedom of expression, and I think, and also personal security, the capacity for people to feel as if if they work hard, then they're able to achieve, and they have motivation to start a business and to know that their own work will pay off. And I just want to compliment both Brazil and Colombia, coming from different political traditions. But part of the reason why you've seen sustained growth is governments have worked effectively in each country. And I think that when we look at how we're going to integrate further and take advantage of increased opportunity in the future, it's very important for us not to ignore how important it is to have a clean, transparent, open government that is working on behalf of its people. And that's important to business as well. The days when a business feels good working in a place where people are being oppressed, ultimately that's an unstable environment for you to do business. You do business well when you know that it's a well-functioning society and that there's a legitimate government in place that is going to be looking out for its people. So I just want to thank both of my outstanding partners here. They're true leaders in the region, and I can speak, I think, for the United States to say that we've never been more excited about the prospects of working as equal partners with our brothers and sisters in Latin America and the Caribbean, because that's going to be the key to our success. All right?
President Santos.
Muchas gracias, Chris, y quiero
Chris, and I want to welcome the President of Brazil, Dilma Rousseff, and I want to welcome President Barack Obama, and I want to tell him how pleased we, all the Colombians, are, and I thank all the ones that are here for your presence here in Colombia, for being here in Cartagena and in such an important forum. I am I'm in a very odd situation. I'm here in the middle of two titans, and Colombia, in such a way, it's in the middle in many cases. We are geographically between Brazil and the U.S. I think that politically, we're in the middle as well. Okay, what I was telling you yesterday about the third way and a practical focus, both in the economic area, we're also in the middle. And we also have an issue here in Colombia, and I think that the rest of the countries in the Americas, and it's that if President Obama sneezes, for example, or if President Dilma gets a cold, we get pneumonia. And therefore, we, in such a way, depend a lot that these two presidents, the president and president, that these two countries work in a coordinated manner. For it's very, very important for us. Each time we're saying, and I'm very pleased, President Obama, to hear you say what you've just said at the end, that never has the U.S. been so excited of working with Latin America. Therefore, this is something that is huge for us, and we value that statement with all the dimension that it may have, because that's what we want. If Brazil and the United States work and they lay some bridges, all the rest of the region, it's going to benefit. And we're going to benefit because we have lots of opportunities to come. And the Americas leave, as you will say, as President Obama will say, that Americas leave behind stereotypes, preventions, that the imperialist Yankees, that Latin America and our countries surrounded by issues, we are partners, as you are well said, that are on equal conditions working for common goals. That attitude, that change of paradigm, the change of mind makes a difference, because it opens the ways and it opens the possibilities for obtaining the goals that we all want and that we're all looking for. So, for example, in this moment that it's rather shaking up, such the deep crisis that the world lived in the year 2008, 2009, and that it's still expressing in many manners, that crisis hasn't concluded yet. Those are crises that come back from the Great Depression, that where Latin America came out well, relatively well. Here, we here didn't suffer the impact that we usually suffered with other crises that would strike us, the Latin Americans, harder, because we hadn't set in execution the appropriate policies, but but we learned. Brazil learned, Colombia learned, many other countries learned, and this crisis affected us, of course, because as President Obama well said, today we can't think that there's no interdependence, that what happens in Bogota it has an effect on New York or Brasilia, but we were less affected because we were better prepared. And this for Latin America is a very important step because it comes accompanied by those principles that President Obama was mentioning and that are necessary for the sustainability of any economic growth, any balanced growth, the democratic principles, the rule of the law, the respect for human rights, for freedom, for the freedom of expression. In general terms, with exceptions, of course, but in general terms, Latin America has progressed in these two fronts. We've been able to set in place some more responsible economic policies, more sustainable economic policies, and at the same time, we've been progressing in perfectioning the political systems and their democracy. This must draw us closer together because this was where part of the difference was before. This is part of the issues we had between North America and Latin America and the Caribbean. And here we are setting ground, and it would be very important, for example, that in this crisis of the world, that the world still hasn't surpassed, that we're striving to get off, sometimes with the wrong policies. I share with President Dilma Rousseff the concern that the Latin American countries have with the expansionist policies of the developed countries, including the U.S., because in such a way that is they're exporting their crisis to us with the depreciation of the currencies that we have in our countries, and that lack of coordination in the search of the roads to get out of this recession is what may bring us a lot of trouble. Therefore, it would be excellent if, for example, in the next meeting of G20, which is where the main decisions are made about the world economy, that it would be good that in that forum we are all going to get together. Colombia was invited by President Calderon to attend to this meeting. It would be great if the Americas had a common position. Would you imagine the impact that would have for the rest of the world, for Europe, for Asia, that from Alaska to the Patagonia, the Americas would be able to arrive with very specific proposals, practical proposals, and things that would be able to be achievable? Imagine the impact that would have not only for the rest of the world, but the message that we would send for that integration, that it's necessary and that we should look for every day amongst the countries of Latin America and the countries of North America and the US and Canada. Here we have some very interesting scenarios to be able to work together, and I think that in very few occasions have we gone together to discuss these types of issues, and I think that if we sit down together, we're going to find common denominators where we can work together and where we can start creating a synergy, a huge synergy. Brazil and the US, just those two countries, agreeing on a meeting as the G20, accompanied by the rest of Latin America and Canada. You imagine the weight that might have. It's going to be significant. And that's going to start creating a series of trust, reliability, and that no doubtly is going to have very positive impact. There is a common denominator amongst all of us that should be one of those principles that we should keep in our head in all the decisions that we make. And I think that's what concerns us most, if we make a survey, for example, President Obama is in his political campaign, I'm sure that you do your surveys every day. If we do a survey in Brazil or here in Colombia and we ask the people what concerns them most, I'm almost certain that in all the hemisphere the answer is going to be employment, jobs, work. And if we can find these policies that if we all worked together, they're going to allow us all to generate more employment. For example, in Brazil, in Colombia, in the US, in all the Americas, that is going to be a very important step in that integration, because that would be a way in which all the things that we're doing, which is extremely important and that also sounds very pretty, but that it's not translated into real benefits, then the people start to have certain skepticism as the free trade agreements, for example, and even the investment flows, which are necessary conditions, but for what? To bring benefits to the people. And the biggest benefit that we can bring to the people, it's employment, is jobs. The people that have jobs, to be able to keep their jobs, to improve the quality of the jobs, the ones that are unemployed, well, being able to offer them a job. If we would able to agree on the fact that we're going to coordinate our policies so that what it's done in the United States is not to export unemployment, or that what it's done in Brazil doesn't affect the employment of other countries, that we can keep that criteria in the mind of the governors, of the ministers, and of the businessmen, that would be a huge step in that integration that we are looking for and that we have all identified as necessary. I just want to leave that seed planted, and I wanted to thank Rousseff and President Obama once again for being here.
President Santos, on behalf of everyone here, I want to congratulate you for a wonderful welcome you've given all of us here. It's been the warmest welcome I've ever gotten in my life. It's a wonderful city, Cartagena. And last night, spectacular. I don't think I've seen anything like it. And President Rousseff, I know you're a Democrat and a populist hero in your country, but I do want to congratulate you on just passing the United Kingdom as the 6th largest economy in the world. I can only imagine what would it be like if Argentina did that. And I'm not talking about soccer. Anyway, let me start. We only have a little time. You guys must have learned the Dean Smith rule of basketball. You've controlled the ball here now for most of the time. The four-corner offense was in effect. Let me go to you, President Santos, and thank you so much for this honor to be here. I guess there's some issues in America. We have a very large Hispanic population. 10% of our electorate is going to be Hispanic in background. We are the second largest Spanish-speaking country in the world after Mexico. People have dual languages in the United States, of course, but they're so much Spanish-speaking. You have a chance to sit next to President Obama now. Do you want to ask him about the ways you think the United States could help your country in the drug war?
Chris, ¿no tiene una pregunta un poco más fácil?
Don't you have a simpler question?
Can we improve North-South relations, generally speaking?
No, lo que nosotros estamos...
What we are saying, it's simply the possible, President Obama. What we're saying is that Colombia has been one of the countries that has suffered, of all the countries in the planet, Colombia is the one that has suffered more in this war against drug trafficking. It's a war that was declared by President Nixon in 1971, but that goes way back. Even the famous convention of the opium. And we've been fighting, we've been struggling, and we've been successful thanks to the help of the United States. Plan Colombia, I think it's the best initiative, the best bipartisan initiative approved by the U.S. Congress. I think it's been the most successful thing approved by the U.S. government in the last years. And I think that this is something that we in Colombia appreciate fondly. I remember that here in Cartagena, I was the finance minister when President Clinton was here to launch Plan Colombia. We were about to be a failed state, and we were able to be declared a failed state. Today, the situation is totally different, amongst other things, thanks to Plan Colombia, which was a way to help us combat the power of the mafias and drug trafficking. And we've been relatively successful. We've been able to learn to combat each of the steps of drug trafficking, from the crops to the labs, and seizures, the assets of the drug dealers, the money laundering, the legal system. We've been improving all of that up to the point that today we are offering this type of help, this type of assistance to other countries that don't have that capacity. We can say, as with all the indicators, that we've been relatively successful. However, we know that our success has generated issues in other countries, the famous balloon effect. The effect of the water balloon, that if you press it in one side, it comes out of the other. And sometimes we struggle and we pedal, and we feel that we are on a static bicycle. Therefore, I think that we are in a moment, right now, we're in the moment of analyzing if what we are doing, it's the best that we can do, or if we can maybe find an alternative that is much more effective and less expensive for the societies in general. This is a topic that is highly politically sensitive. Once again, talking about surveys, if you do a survey in each of the countries, in any country, and we ask if drugs should be legalized, the people are immediately going to say no. The mothers of the children that see that their kids are smoking pot or doing cocaine, they're going to say, no way. But we have the obligation to see if we're doing the best that we can do, or if there are other alternatives that can be much more efficient. On one side, it can be to put all the consumers go to jail. The other extreme is legalization. On the middle ground, we may have more practical policies, for example, to do more things on seizures, on trafficking, focusing on that. We don't know what to do with crops. But none of that can be done if we don't have real information, clear, concise information, technical information analyzed by experts in public health, experts in people who fight against organized crime, experts in alternative development, because all the discussions, at least all the ones I've attended in the last years, they have a big emotional factor because of the political sensitivity of the issue. Therefore, the only thing that I'm saying, without lowering the guard, because in the Colombian case we can't lower the guard, because for us this is a topic of national security, because drug dealing is what feeds all the violent groups in the country. We can't let our guard down, but I think that we have the obligation as the world, not as the country, but as a world, to analyze if what we are doing is the best thing that can be done. Maybe we get to the conclusion that amongst all the evils, this is the least worst evil, and we keep on working the same way. But maybe doing a very thorough, rigorous analysis, objective analysis, we can be able to derive another conclusion. This is what we're saying.
You want me to respond to it?
Yes, sir.
Well, this is a conversation that I've had with President Santos and others. Just as the world economy is integrated, so unfortunately the drug trade is integrated. And we can't look at the issue of supply in Latin America without also looking at the issue of demand in the United States. And so whether it's working with President Santos or supporting the courageous work that President Calderon is doing in Mexico, I personally and my administration, and I think the American people understand that the toll of narco-trafficking on the societies of Central America, the Caribbean, and parts of South America are brutal and undermining the capacity of those countries to protect their citizens and eroding institutions and corrupting institutions in ways that are ultimately bad for everybody. So this is part of the reason why we've invested, Chris, about $30 billion in prevention programs, drug treatment programs, looking at the drug issue not just from a law enforcement and interdiction issue, but also from a public health perspective. This is why we've worked in unprecedented fashion in cooperation with countries like Mexico on not just drugs coming north, but also guns and cash going south. This is one of the reasons why we have continued to invest in programs like Plan Colombia, but also now are working with Colombia, given their best practices around issues of citizen security, to have not just the United States, but Colombia provide technical assistance and training to countries in Central America and the Caribbean in finding ways that they can duplicate some of the success that we've seen in Colombia. So we're mindful of our responsibilities on this issue. And I think it is entirely legitimate to have a conversation about whether the laws in place are ones that are doing more harm than good in certain places. I personally, and my administration's position, is that legalization is not the answer. That, in fact, if you think about how it would end up operating, the capacity of a large-scale drug trade to dominate certain countries, if they were allowed to operate legally without any constraint, could be just as corrupting, if not more corrupting, than the status quo. Nevertheless, I'm a big believer in looking at the evidence, having a debate. I think ultimately what we're going to find is that the way to solve this problem is both in the United States, us dealing with demand in a more effective way, but it's also going to be strengthening institutions at home. You mentioned earlier the biggest thing that's on everybody's minds, whether it's the United States, Canada, Brazil, Colombia, Jamaica, is can I find a job that allows me to support my family and allows my children to advance and feel secure? And in those societies where you've got strong institutions, you've got strong business investment, you've got rule of law, you have a law enforcement infrastructure that is sound, and an economy that's growing, that country is going to be like a healthy body that is more immune than countries that have weak institutions and high unemployment, in which kids see their only future as participating in the drug trade because nobody's actually trained them to get a job with Google or Pepsi or start their own small business. And so I think that it's important for us not to think that if somehow we look at the drug issue in isolation, in the absence of dealing with some of these other challenges, institutional challenges and barriers to growth and opportunity and the capacity for people to climb their way out of poverty, that we're going to be able to solve this problem. The drug issue in this region is in some ways a cause, but it's also in some ways an effect of some broader and underlying problems. And we as the United States have an obligation not only to get our own house in order, but also to help countries in a partnership to try to see if we can move in a better direction.
Thank you, Mr. President. President Rousseff, let's go back to the big picture of the whole question of this hemisphere and the future. We've had in the past bad relations between North and South. We've also had attempts at good relations. Franklin Roosevelt's good neighbor policy, Kennedy's Alliance for Progress. Your country is enormously important now in the world. It's a global power. It's one of the leading BRIC countries in the world. As you look to the future of the 21st century, what do you think the model should be for hemispheric relations among the nations of the hemisphere? Should it be different than it's been? Is there a new model that you foresee between North and South?
Well, the model, I believe, is the suitable model, is one based on partnership, but at the same time on a dialogue between / among equals. I believe that in the past, the asymmetric relations between the North and the South have been responsible for very negative processes in our countries. Even if we cannot and should not go back to the past and impregnate ourselves in minds of standards and models of the past, it is nevertheless important to state that for a very long period of time, more precisely in the past few years, in the past 20 years to be more precise, the fact is and remains that Latin America lived in a state of recession, unemployment, and expanding inequality, and even worse, absence of any realistic outlook for growth. So that recent process that took place in Latin America, the recent developments in Latin America have been essentially about stating the importance of the population of the continent. Just a few minutes ago, you congratulated me for being the 6th largest GDP in the world. I mean, on the backstage a few minutes ago. And I said, great, that's a wonderful compliment. Yes, indeed, I take it as a compliment. But the fact is that a country, a ruler, and its business community should always be held accountable for the following question. Who do we have the 6th largest GDP in the world for? I mean, that GDP has to be there to benefit the Brazilian population, ultimately speaking. So, of course, I agree with President Obama and also with President Santos as to their remarks on jobs, and above all, as to what they said regarding income distribution. In Brazil, it is not enough to simply and merely create jobs. That is not enough. In addition to creating jobs, we must grow to the point of being in a position to, yes, distribute income. And that is why I believe that a virtuous type of relationship here is one that respects, of course, countries' sovereignty, while at the same time, and more importantly, takes into account mutual development amongst nations as a key and crucial element on the agenda. And yes, we are in a position to engage in that kind of development. We have the wherewithal. And may I place the emphasis on education in this regard. May I also emphasize that high-quality education is about, or is ultimately the primary and major objective of our governments in Latin America, because that will ultimately translate our country's ability to be de facto independent, truly independent countries, and therefore be in a position to create and add value, create science, technology, and innovation. We cannot, just please ourselves, although it is an important factor, by being simply producers of raw materials, foodstuffs, and crude energy or gross energy. No, we have to sustain the ambition of being countries that in the 21st century will engage in a kind of relationship with other countries within the framework and vision that the 21st century is marked by knowledge. The 21st century is one where the key challenge before us is that of fostering, creating societies where our populations will indeed be given access to what can perhaps be described as the best and the biggest fruit and, say, outcome of a balanced growth trajectory in any country. And that is about, of course, ensuring opportunities to all, above all, education opportunities. If we are not able to secure education opportunities and proper training and development of our manpower and an industry that is in a position to add value and content and be competitive and productive in terms of high throughput levels, if we fail in those respects, we will not have the wherewithal required to become truly developed nations. Brazil wants to change itself and become a developed nation. To that end, it is not enough simply to have GDP growth. We need more than that. Hence, why we need to engage in pro-integration processes, and of course hence the importance of having a proper north-south relationship and a more balanced relationship between developed and developing countries, because that is the kind of process and actions that will benefit us all. A continent that has more than 700, actually almost 1 billion people. Can you imagine what this continent would be like if it were properly endowed with people who are in a position to properly produce and consume, and above all, people who are properly schooled, educated, and in a position to add value to their economy? So I see in this partnership among us a partnership that is necessarily one amongst equals. No one can possibly produce science, knowledge, and high-quality education among parties or among countries that are asymmetric or unequal. I mean, all of us have our own experience in that regard. I mean, all of us were colonized countries and settled by third parties, including the United States, which engaged in a very strong, successful campaign, had to go to the battlefront in civil war to defend and assert its sovereignty as a colonized nation. So we all know that there can be no dialogue amongst or between unequal people or countries. Actual dialogue and actual exchanges and actual cooperation can only take place if we place ourselves or position ourselves as countries that depend on each other mutually in order to make the world a more prosperous place. Now, there's one important point here to be highlighted time and again. This is a country that spent, I mean, not this country, rather, the speaker herself, this continent spent 100 or has spent 140 years in peace. There have been no conflicts, no warfare, no religious conflicts whatsoever in this continent for 140 years on end. So that gives us the wherewithal, the institutional conditions required for us to move ahead towards the pathway of prosperity. And yes, I agree, and I would like to praise President Obama for the open government initiative launched by his administration. I think that is essential and key for our countries. It is essential and fundamental that we practice government accountability, transparency, monitoring, control, checkings, and so forth. Not only to foster a better business environment, but also to ensure we are able to offer high-quality job opportunities for our education, or rather for our populations. In order to provide high-quality educational opportunities, we will also have to have in place a meritocracy or a merit-based system in our societies, and that applies not only to the government but also to the state apparatus. We will have to live up to a standard of efficiency and respect towards citizenry at large. So I think that the open government initiative launched by President Obama is really an excellent and outstanding one. And it is a partnership or initiative where Brazil is a co-chair.
I've just gotten a call that we have 4 or 5 minutes left. Mr. President, do you want to respond? I think the question that seems to be apparent here in the last couple of days is, first of all, tremendous enthusiasm and a zeitgeist here that's almost unusual in the world for positive optimism about the development of this part of the world. It's not like it was. It just isn't the way it was we grew up with. The challenge, I think, you just heard from the President of Brazil was the notion that Latin America is not interested in being our complementary economy anymore. The agricultural end, while we do the industrial end. They do the provision of raw materials, and we do the finest, highest level, high-tech work. How do you respond to Brazil's demand, really, to be partners and rivals? They want to use our educational resources. They want to come north to learn how to compete with us. Right, Mr. President, Madam President?
Well,
you want to be equals. You want to learn everything we know and then take it back and shove it at us, right? Isn't that it? Well, anyway, that's the response. I'm asking for your response.
Chris, I'm not sure you're characterizing what President Rousseff said, but this is what happens when you get some of our U.S. political commentators moderating a panel. They try to stir up things. that may not always be there. But, and Chris is good at it. He's one of the best. But look, this is already happening. This has already happened. Brazil has changed, Colombia has changed, and we welcome the change. The notion somehow that we see this as a problem is just not the case, because if we've got a strong, growing, prosperous middle class in Latin America, those are new customers for our businesses. We want Brazil is growing, and that opportunity is broad-based. Then suddenly they're interested in buying iPads, and they're interested in buying Boeing airplanes. And
Ou Embraer.
I was just trying to see how she'd respond to that. But the point is that that's a market for us. So we in the United States should welcome not just growth, but broad-based growth of the sort that President Rousseff described. I'll give you just, I said I was in Tampa. All those containers that are coming in, they have, in some cases, commodities coming from Latin America, but they also have finished products that are coming in from Latin America. We have commodities that are going into Latin America that we're sending back on those containers, as well as finished products. And so this is a two-way street. When I came into office, one of my first decisions was to say that the G20 was not a temporary thing to respond to the world economic crisis. This should be the permanent forum for determining and coordinating direction in the world economy. And frankly, there were some folks who were members of the G8 who were upset with me about that determination. But realistically, you can't coordinate world economic issues if you don't have China and Brazil and India and South Africa at the table, and Mexico. That's not possible. So the world has changed. I think the United States and U.S. businesses stand to benefit from those changes. But it does mean that we have to adapt to that competitive environment, and all the advantages that President Rousseff mentioned we have as the United States, its flexibility, our scientific edge, our well-educated workforce, our top universities, those are the things that we continue to have to build and get better at. And that's true for every country here. Every one of the businesses here are going to be making determinations about where you locate based on the quality of the workforce. How much investment do you have to make in training somebody to handle $1 million piece of equipment? Do you feel as if your intellectual property is going to be protected? Do you feel as if there's a good infrastructure to be able to get your products to market? And so I think this is a healthy competition that we should be encouraging. And what I've said at the first summit that I came to, Summit of the Americas that I came to, was we do not believe there are junior partners and senior partners in this situation. We believe there are partners. And Brazil is in many ways ahead of us on something like biofuels. Well, we should learn from them. And if we're going to be trying to mount a regional initiative, let's make sure that Brazil's taking the lead. It doesn't have to be us in every situation. Now, the flip side is, and I'll close with this, I think in Latin America, part of the change in mentality is also not always looking to the United States as the reason for everything that happens that goes wrong. So I I was in an interview, several interviews yesterday. These were actually with Spanish-speaking television stations that have broadcast back in the United States. And the first interviewer said, why hasn't the United States done more to promote democracy in the region? Because you've done a lot in the Arab Spring, but it seems as if you're not dealing with some of the problems here in Latin America. The next questioner said, why are you being so hard on Cuba and promoting democracy all the time? So, but that's an example, I think, of some of the challenges we face that are rooted in legitimate historical grievances, but it becomes a habit. And when it comes to economic integration and exchanges, I'm completely sympathetic to the fact that there are challenges around monetary policy in developed and less developed countries. And Brazil, for example, has seen the real appreciate in ways that have been hurtful. I would argue a lot of that has to do with the failure of some other countries to engage in rebalancing, not the United States. But having said that, I think there's not a country in Latin America who doesn't want to see the United States grow rapidly because we're your major export market. And so most of these issues end up being complicated issues. Typically, they involve both actions in the United States as well as actions in the other countries if we're going to optimize the kind of growth and prosperity and broad-based opportunity that both President Santos and President Rousseff have spoken about. And the United States comes here and says, we're ready to do business. We are open to a partnership. We don't expect to be able to dictate the terms of that partnership. We expect it to be a negotiation based on mutual interests and mutual respect, and I think we're all going to benefit as a consequence of that.
Thank you. The hombre in the middle, Mr. President Santos, you want to finish?
I just want to cite an example, a specific example, to answer the question of how or the matter of how investing in another country will create a rivalry. It's actually the contrary. We all win when there's investment. A few weeks ago, the CEO of a non-American company in Colombia, the CEO of Unilever, and he said, I want to go to Colombia and I want to make a significant investment. And I asked him, why do you want to come here? And he said, look, we need to seek sources of growth for our company, for our products. You in Latin America are bringing millions of people out from poverty. And here in Colombia, we have implemented a plan that seeks to bring 1.2 million people out of extreme poverty and over 7 million people out of poverty. And these are potential consumers for my product, he said, and they will be permanent consumers. And that is why, and this is a huge business opportunity for me, for my country, he said, and it's a huge opportunity for you as a Colombian. We all win. And that is why if we take on problems with this mindset and the businessmen and women here execute these policies that we set in motion as presidents and leaders, we will all win. If we send our citizens to the United States to learn and then we apply those things that we learned in our countries, then we will be more prosperous, but the United States will be more prosperous as well. Because just as you are a very important market, we are also one of your most important markets. will be a win-win situation for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President Rousseff, President Santos, and my president, President Obama. Thank you. It's been an honor.
Thank you.
Obrigado, Chris.